Good evening, everyone. My name is Valerie Blanks, and this is Real Work's first town hall. And we are talking about social justice tonight. And of course, we're talking about social justice with the times that we're living in. It's a very important topic. And as people who are affiliated with Real Works, it's important that we figure out what we're going to do going forward to make sure that we are all in the fight for social justice. We know that the Black Lives Matter movement is now kind of firmly within the muscle memory of our country, so to speak, but we want to understand how best we can keep the fight going. And we really want to get a good understanding of what justice looks like. We have several really esteemed panelists tonight that are going to be speaking to us about social justice, how to create a more equitable society that we live in. But initially, I just want to say our broader question tonight is, what does social justice look like, and how can we move it forward? And in talking about that, we're going to show you a video on social justice.
What happens next after Black Lives Matter stops trending? What's next when the protests start to dwindle? When economies open up and people return to their daily lives and the movement is no longer at the forefront, what is next? What's next? Justice. When you think about what justice is, you think about fairness. But in this country, you kind of have to ask yourself the question, can we have justice in a country that has never been just? Can we have justice in a space that has never offered justice to the masses here? In order to have justice here, we have to reimagine how we see each other. We have to reimagine, and let me be more specific, white people have to reimagine how they see people of color, more specifically Black people.
All these white people, me, we have all of this privilege which can be used to help, which can be used to alleviate other voices that have been fighting for a long time in this movement. We have a duty with this privilege to reduce our own privilege. As a white person, you are either anti-racist or striving for anti-racism, or you're a racist. There's no real in between. You can't just secede from these systems. You can't say, oh, I'm just not gonna take part in education or healthcare, all these different things. And if you contribute to those systems, if you maintain them, then you are, as a white person, you are a racist white person.
So we're at the moment where white folks have to really, really have an introspective moment in this time here. Because racism is not everyone, it's not equal opportunity. Everyone in our society, we don't have the power to be racist. We don't have power over institutions to control people and their life's outcomes. So when we're talking about justice, that's a broad, we're talking about fairness. There's never been fairness here. That's the basic of that word justice, just a synonym. The basic synonym of justice is fairness. We've never had it here. So when we talk about it existing here, we're talking about reimagining the entire, what Americana stands for.
Capitalism needs racism, it needs sexism, it needs homophobia, and it needs a divide between the working class, whether it be through racism, sexism, any of that. There is a feeling that comes with being surrounded by people who are as angry as you and wanting change as much as you, and that really builds class consciousness. It builds hope, you know? It's very, very hopeful to be surrounded by those type of people, and so for the ruling class, that's scary. When there is a group of multiracial, unified, angry people, especially young people, who are not afraid to be in the streets every night, that is horrifying for this government, because there is that sense of working class unity. And so maintaining that and kind of not being sucked back into your normal life is working towards justice.
Well, that was a powerful video. I've watched it several times, and I'm inspired and moved by it every time I watch it, especially at the end when we're talking about our movement towards social justice and not getting sucked back into our normal everyday lives. I remember on Instagram, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez said, "We're not going back to brunch. We're not going back to brunch." So when we talk about social justice moving forward, when we look at the film that we just watched with all of the marches and the hands and fists in the air and the speeches that were being given, we want to know what can we be doing going forward. Lisa Votino, you are a remarkable community organizer who works on civil rights issues out on Long Island. And you were one of the people who spearheaded the Black Lives Matter movement out in Long Island this summer. But now that the marches have died down, the speeches have given way a little bit, what can we do to keep the fire burning? What can we do to continue working towards social justice?
So, first of all, thanks. And I think even people hear, you know, what's in the news, but they don't realize how much work is actually being done on the ground every single second of every day right now. We sort of, from our perspective out here, we basically said we're all going to keep in touch base, but we're going to make sure that Black Lives Matter in every aspect of our society. So wherever my privilege takes me, or wherever somebody might need some backup, that we kind of made a pact to each other that we would be there. We're doing a lot on police reform from the state's executive order, but yeah, that's really the best thing, you know, college students asking for more, you know, African American history based courses, more representation in their schools, in their workplaces, and just everything, everywhere. Like, this is not something that's going to happen overnight, but it's something that we need to make normal. And,
Yes.
and that's what we're doing.
That's so good to hear. And as you're talking about the students who are asking for changes to be made on their college campuses and curriculums, and them also getting together, I'm sure, and talking about it more and more, we are hopefully in that mode of normalizing it. But I want to hear what our educators have to say. Dr. Aaron Johnson, you're featured on this film very prominently, and you are an award-winning educator who's been recognized for your dedication to social justice, activism, and education. And you're on the forefront with our kids because you see them every day. So from your vantage point as an educator, what can we do as parents, as people in the community, to help our kids and assist them in this fight for social justice? What tools can we give them to help them start to create a more equitable society?
Well, and thank you very, very much for having me and for having this event and having us all on. It's super important. Endeavoring for justice requires a paradigm shift. I think a lot of us Americans, we unfortunately have rationalized and justified brutality, inequity, and racism as par for the course in American society. Has been normalized in such a way that there is actually an opposing side to the slogan or mantra Black Lives Matter. I mean, just let that sink in for a second. You know, separate the slogan from the organization for a second. Black people are literally asserting that their lives, their existence, their children, their family matter. And the slogan is necessary because of the disproportionate brutality and institutional inequities that befall Black people. So justice is recognizing the insanity of centuries-long rape, torture, murder, theft, and enslavement culture that existed here for so long. You know, justice is accepting that Jim Crow and race massacres and white domestic terrorism and real estate redlining and arresting and killing and exiling Black political leadership, mass incarceration that feeds the prison industrial complex, among many other things, have prevented actual justice from existing here. Justice means stop discussing Black life through a politicized lens and humanize Black people. Black people don't exist for entertainment or sports purposes. Black people don't exist to be a voting bloc for a particular political party, or one political party or another. Justice means stop creating false equivalences around the slogan Black Lives Matter and yearning for Black humanity to be recognized in a racist political party, political or social or cultural construct, I should say. Justice is legitimizing Black narratives and perspectives. Fairness and equity are synonyms of the word justice. So in that respect, justice has never lived here in America. So justice means really suspending the use of the word equality, right? Until equity has been fully embraced and actualized. Justice is establishing an institutional response to inequity. In order for this to occur, a re-education must happen, right? Empathy, we need to inspire empathy, which could lead to action for equity. The majority, more specifically white people, must be interested in the institutional approach for equity. They must be on board for broad change, and that exists far beyond performative acts of protest, right? So justice is reparations for American descendants of enslaved human beings that were held in centuries and multiple generations long barbarous bondage for the purposes of building the wealthiest nation on the planet. You can never speak about justice without dealing first with reparations for Black people, period. So Black reparations matter. Black economic power matters, and Black security matters. And finally, at the end of the day, there are many stains on the fabric of America. Choosing to ignore them won't make them disappear. So there is no gray area to goodness. There's no middle ground to righteousness. Justice means really, really being on the right side of history. And hopefully one day that long arc of the moral universe will actually bend towards justice, as Dr. King believed it would before he was brutally cut down by white supremacists. We need to embody what justice is.
Yes, and everything that you said rings so true, especially also for your partner, Jill Bloomberg. Jill, you are an impassioned educator, and you are so committed to combating the ways in which racism and inequality shape educational policies and school practices. You were a teacher in the Chicago public school system, but for the last 14 years, you were principal here at Park Slope Collegiate here in Brooklyn, where you tirelessly worked to build an anti-racist integrated school. Your work is phenomenal, but it didn't come without any pushback. Piggybacking off of what Dr. Johnson just said, what do we need to do to create a more equitable educational system? The schools are where we're learning or not learning what we need to do to create a more just society. These young people that are coming up today are our future in every sense of the phrase. And you were doing the work trying to make Park Slope Collegiate a non-racist, anti-racist school. Can you speak to what we need to look to our educational system? What kind of overhauls we should see happening there? What can we push for?
Yeah, thank you, Valerie. And I want to just thank the other panelists. I think it's important that Dr. Johnson reminded us, because we're going to be talking in the present, but what has gone on in the past has to be the backdrop. It's why we are where we are today. And so, Dr. Johnson, I thank you for reminding us of all of that. And I agree wholeheartedly that a synonym for justice is equity. And so really briefly in schools, I firmly believe that separate will never be equal. I know there were many problems with the 20th century attempts at school integration. Thousands and thousands of Black educators lost their jobs. Black students were sent to go be by themselves quite often without any support into schools that were predominantly white and where there was no attempt to address the racism. They were segregated within those schools in separate classrooms based on somebody's false notion of their ability or their intelligence. And I think we need to learn from those mistakes. But I think that without fighting for equitable, integrated, anti-racist schools, there's just no way that we can teach our students their common humanity. And so I think that that's really important. And I think what we've learned from the past is that an integrated school, in order for it to be an anti-racist and an equitable school, among other things, has to ask the question, what false ideas have we used to justify inequality in the past? And I think when we ask that question, it's a clue for us about what we need to do. So in schools, absolutely false and racist ideas about intelligence, which is something that simply does not exist beyond our common humanity. There is absolutely no way in the world for any educator, for any scientist to say, this child is smarter than this child. It's an absolutely false concept. And if anything in schools says, here's the reason this child deserves more than another child, then we need to question that practice. That when we think about what are the ideas we use to say one child deserves a better education, more education, there is something wrong with that practice. And so this idea that some students merit this school or this sports team or that sports team, or they've earned the right to go into their school building without being frisked and scanned by a metal detector. Some students in our system, we're told, deserve to be greeted at the door by their educators, while other students, for some reason, and we have to ask those reasons, and they are always wrong. They're always false. They're always rooted in racist ideas. And so those are the ideas that we have to challenge with our students, that until you can tell me a real reason why one person merits or deserves more than another, and you can hold on to that idea, otherwise we need equity, and that's what our students deserve in their schools.
Absolutely. And we are privileged to have a student on the panel with us for this justice panel. Maryam, you are a high school senior at Medgar Edgar's College Preparatory School here in Brooklyn. And I'm sure as a young person, you've seen a lot of the inequality that this system can dole out on a daily basis and how it has negatively impacted people that you know. But now you're taking charge. You're on the steering committee of Teens Take Charge, which is a student-led activist group dedicated to integrating New York City public high schools. And you guys are always looking to answer the question, how can we move toward a more equitable system for all? So if you could just share with us a little bit about Teens Take Charge, what you've been experiencing with this organization, and what you feel is happening in the educational landscape. Have you seen any types of moves forward? We're talking to Jill. She's talking about all the efforts that she put forward at Parksville Collegiate. What are you seeing as a student in these schools, and what changes would you like to see going forward?
So a lot of the time when I am at school and I am interacting with other students at not only at my school but like at other schools, it's almost I you can clearly see that there's this huge power imbalance between me and them. And though before I couldn't put my finger on it and be like, that's not right. It's just like it always felt like it was wrong. And it was not until I got to high school and actually had like the power and like the initiative to go out and learn more about, you know, the way, like learn more about like what I'm seeing in my schools and what I'm seeing all around me. Is that's when I finally started to realize that, wait, this is not right. And that's what I feel like a lot of people never get to. They never get to the point where they admit that this is not right and this needs to change, because they're just so used to the way things are and they're so engrossed in their perfect ideal of like, this is, everything is perfect and I don't want anything to change, that they never come to the point of realization that these policies are hurting students and these policies need to change now. And so a lot of it is it has to do with the fact that it's ingrained in the system. I go to a special case of a high school where it's just like it's a majority Black and brown school, but they still strive for excellence in every way. So they do offer us a lot of um, academically rigorous courses, but it's a matter of can we actually complete those courses successfully? And for a lot of the students at that school, the answer is still no. And it's the same as most Black and brown schools in that neighborhood, where it's just like, yes, they're outperforming the schools in that neighborhood, but they still come nowhere near nor close to other schools in New York City as a whole. So it's just like, no matter what you do, even if you do it at an individual level, the fate that succumbs you as a Black and brown school or as a Black and brown student in this country will always hold true if we're not making an active effort to dismantle the systems of racism within our governments and within all institutions that exist. So that is the primary reason that I joined Teens Take Charge. It is it is to basically I joined Teens Take Charge to I basically joined Teens Take Charge to sort of take charge and say that these policies and these specific things that you are doing and that you're still implementing and that you're still standing by are racist outright. That's what it is, and that's what I'm calling it. One of our main campaigns, which is that we're running right now, is Unscreen Our Schools, and it's basically centered around the SHSATs and how you are you're still continue to give a test to students that for years and years and years have shown that only a certain group of students can pass, and the others are at the bottom, even though they are performing their best at their school, even though if they're performing the highest and possible that they're reaching the highest possible achievement that they can. And to me, like, I've seen students personally that in my school that have taken the test, and they pretty much outperformed me and like everyone in the school, but they took the test and they couldn't even pass, and like they didn't even get into a specialized high school, even though they were doing the best at the school, doing the best with the resources they had. So at this point, it's not a matter of are you competent enough, it's a matter of did you even get what you were supposed to get in order to pass that. It's a matter of, is our people actually making an active effort to dismantle racism? There is a matter of our people actually putting in conscious effort when they're making these policies and implementing these policies. Are they conscious of the fact that there is a power imbalance within the system? And that at TTC is my main job.
Well, listen, I'm blown away by you, and I'm proud of you. You are doing incredible work to be so young. This is totally off script. I have to tell you that I'm proud of you. Keep going. And believe me when I tell you that you are a phenomenal example to all of your friends that know you. They may not tell you, but they're watching you. They're inspired by you, and you give them hope of what the future can be for them. So keep pushing, no matter how hard it gets. Keep pushing, keep fighting, and we're all here to support you. So I'm proud of you, and thank you for what you're doing. Do we want to open it up to some questions from the audience? I see that we have a lot going on in the chat, and we've got some good time to take some questions.
Yeah, I feel like something that we could do here on Long Island is to create more programs to connect the police with the youth, like such as PAL or other things like that.
That's a great comment. Lisa, you're out in Long Island, but although this is an initiative that could take place throughout, New York, but what would you say? What are those efforts? Are you aware of any efforts to unite the students with the police officers through PAL, or which I believe is the Police Athletic League, or through any other initiatives out in Long Island specifically, or just in New York City generally?
So it's funny that this is being brought up tonight. So Governor Cuomo had signed an executive order that said every municipality with a police department had to form a community law enforcement review board to review the policies, to go out and listen to the community, and to submit a plan for reimagining police for that department. And last night we were discussing some of these things, and a few of us raised the issue that it's great that we're doing this, but I was like, raise your hand if you're under 25 and a person of color. And it's an entire, we can talk about police reform until, for the next 30 years. I have a really strong background as far as advocacy goes in the area, but if we're not bringing the people to the table that are getting pulled over by police, that are being racially profiled, that might be our next law enforcement officers, we're missing a key component of this police reform. So it would be advantageous, in my opinion. We said, defunding the police kind of comes into a lot of this, but a lot of it comes down to reallocation of funds. So it would be good to do more youth outreach, and not in a penalizing way, in a way that would be, more responsive in a community. I'm not so big on school resource officers when they're used as, as security guards for schools. And then that was brought up earlier. So there are a lot of things that can be done. I will say that for the first time in a long time, I feel that elected leaders are actually hearing youth, even if it's slightly, they're hearing what's going on. It's just really, we can't relent on that. If we relent on it, then they're not going to do it. We have to keep that pressure on at all times. And there are best practices for this stuff. There's youth courts. There's, I know town of Southampton, where I live, there is a youth council. There's representatives from all the schools, and the students kind of team up and work with facets of the government to have their voices heard. So I think there's things out there that we really could be doing, and we just don't. And it's, if for a kid, it's easy to ignore them for 18 years, right? Like, they're not taxpayers, they're not voting. So let's just ignore it. We can't anymore. The kids are rising up. So my hope is that we do see more of this. And even if it's not police-based, I think civics and government really needs to play a major role in this, that education of how laws are passed, how things are done. Because until you understand how it's currently working, it's hard to undo those things. So big proponent of
that. That's exactly right. In my day, we did have a civics class, and it was very helpful in understanding how things happen. But as you were speaking, it's interesting that you brought up teen court, because I'm a former teen court judge. But I wanted to ask you, Dr. Johnson, what can we do inside the schools to help reimagine the relationship with our youth and police officers? Far too many of our public schools do have what has been described as a security guard in the school. That could be a police officer, it could be someone else, but just the visual of this person, the actions often that take place in school with this person. It's very hard, especially for young people, to feel good about any engagement with the police. So although PAL is a great initiative, it may be difficult to get some youth to want to engage with PAL because they have their own vision of what engagement with police officers looks like. So how can we in the school system, is the school system a place to have this discussion? Where can we reach youth and our police officers to try and reimagine a better relationship going forward?
Thank you for the question. School systems are the exact place where this stuff should be happening, because a lot of parents don't have the resources or knowledge to really educate their children, or in a way that's effective for their kids to be agents of change as well in their schools. However, when we think about the security officer, who was probably a former police officer, he's coming in with a particular perspective and lens. And we already know that America has a racism problem, but we're never taught what racism is. We were never made to take any classes where we unpack what racism, where it comes from, how it has metastasized in our society, how it affects all institutions. We don't even know about that. We know it exists. People of color can understand it, they feel it, but they can't articulate it as well. Not all of them can. All of us are not experts in the field. So the fact that we are ignorant, and I'm saying that in the most literal of senses, I'm not saying it pejoratively, but the fact that we are very, very ignorant in terms of our own issues here in America culturally, that's one problem. The people that we're hiring have implicit biases, period. We're all susceptible to it. If you live in a racist construct and you have been conditioned in America, then you have implicit biases. And chances are, if you're in the superior class, or if you're in a superior racial group, that's the majority here, you have an implicit bias where there's a thought process that you are superior, you're better. It's implicit in nature, and it has been conditioned over time. So if we're not reflecting on reducing our own biases, then in checking our own implicit biases and how they manifest with our discipline policies, with how we engage children, with our curriculum, our hiring practices, then we're going to have a schools will be kind of a microcosm of what's going on outside. So in my opinion, I have a lot of ideas about how we can change. But before I offer those ideas, we must understand that Long Island, especially across the nation, is very segregated. We don't know, we're integrated strangers. We don't know our neighbors, right? So if we happen to be in diverse school systems, we're diverse in name only, right? We're not truly integrated. We don't know each other. Just go to the lunchroom and you see exactly who sits with who, right? Like Dr. Beverly Tatum's While All the Black Children Sit Together in the Cafeteria, right? We already understand by like age 3 years old, we understand this whole racialism, the racialized process that we are within and how it manifests itself. So in our schools, that's primarily the issue. We have these districts that are fiefdoms. They're fiefdoms. They set, tax policy essentially in each district, right? They levy taxes essentially. They control the district, and if they are unwilling, if the Board of Ed and upper administration are unwilling to even discuss implicit bias or systemic racism in education, if that's not even a discussion in every single school board meeting and every single cabinet upper administration meeting, then we're missing the boat. And I can tell you that a lot of schools are missing that boat purposefully. And so that's the first thing. Systemically, organizationally, we have a problem. On top of that, the things that we can do, however, is have like a DNI, like a DEI, I should say, diversity, equity, and inclusivity kind of like chief officer that then empowers systems within the school and kids to have these discussions about how they feel about where they go to school, bring those issues to administration bring it to upper administration and then to the board, and create policy that's going to help normalize equity within the school.
Let me pause you. Michaela, did you get that? Did you get what Dr. Johnson is saying? Is that similar to your comment about maybe there could be a club at school with police and young teens helping the community together or things of that nature? But Dr. Johnson is also saying is that maybe there could be groups of students that get together and come up with suggestions that they would like to see in regards to diversity and inclusion in their school, and bring that to the principal or whomever, and have those policies discussed and talked about, of course, against the backdrop of we have a problem. But does that help in any way, Michaela? Does what our panelists have, what they said, has that been helpful at all to you as giving you tools to go forward to create a more equitable school environment for yourself?
Yeah, definitely. I feel like there should be a group of students that discuss the issues of racism in the school. Like I noticed that in my high school, in the common area, we have several murals, and in those murals, there are no people of color. There's no people of color in those murals. So if we could get a group of students together to talk about that, it would really be beneficial for the community.
And you know what I think too? Oh yes, Maryam, please go ahead.
No, I think that was me.
That was you? Yes, Joe,
Yeah.
please.
I just wanted to jump in a little bit and say, it's interesting that Michaela mentioned a mural. We have this beautiful mural on the wall at Park Slope Collegiate that shows the students lined up to go through the metal detectors. But actually, as they go through the metal detectors, they join in a very integrated group of students carrying a banner that says, "An injustice to one is an injustice to all," carrying signs that say, "We're scholars, not suspects."
Wow.
And we're not criminals. And they ultimately push the metal detectors off a cliff, which I think is a great thing to do. I would really like to see schools not have any police presence at all. I don't think that the education that we want to offer our students at school, I don't think the most important lesson we can teach them, and that it's our responsibility to teach them at all, how to deal with law enforcement. Because the message and the inequities that many people on the panel have raised only become implicit because they've been explicit for so long, and that there are so many systems. So most schools, most students in the country do not go through metal detectors and do not encounter police officers in their schools. And so when we look at Black and brown students are disproportionately policed at school in the same ways that they are outside of school. And that has to stop. That actually, every metal detector should be removed from every school building in the nation so that our students are not taught when they walk into the school building, you are not safe with each other. The metal detectors and the police officers in the school say to the students, you need to be protected from each other. That's a horrible message to teach our students. And it is taught overwhelmingly to Black and brown students. It's not taught in all white schools. When there are safety agents at all white schools, the message is really clear. We're here at the door in case there's some outside danger that comes in. But in schools that have metal detectors, and in New York City, school safety agents work for the NYPD. The very clear message is that school safety means the problem is inside the school. And so I agree with Maryam that the safety at the school, I would put the teens in charge of that. And I think that the more we set up structures that help students understand, you far from fearing each other, you are each other's future. And if you look at all of the students demonstrating in the street and the young people building the kind of community to be activists against racism, nothing builds that kind of community and camaraderie of linking arms, standing shoulder to shoulder against racism with each other. And that's the best civics lesson that our students could ever have.
Absolutely.
Can I piggyback on that just for 2 seconds? And what's unfortunate is on Long Island, we replicate that city model, but we do it with retired officers a lot of times. So that's kind of like the loop around, right? We don't have active Suffolk County PD in our classes, in our schools, but we'll have the retired NYPD or retired Suffolk PD as our security guards, and they police the schools exactly in the way in which they did their job, which is problematic for a lot of our students.
Absolutely. Absolutely. I think we've got a few more questions in the chat. I want to make sure that we get all of our questions answered, but this is such a robust discussion, especially as it relates to our young people's sometimes first encounter with the police is in a place where they're supposed to be safe and learn. And that messaging is incredibly powerful, incredibly problematic. So I'm glad that we're talking about this. I'm glad because the goal is to walk away from this town hall with so many things on our brain that we can't even sleep tonight, but that it invigorates us and energizes us to keep going forward with the fight. It's getting cold outside. So many of us are not going to be marching in a couple of months, even if something does occur, but we've got to keep the fire in our hearts. So I want to continue with the questions, but what we're discussing right now is so very important, and I appreciate all of the comments and the questions being asked. Do we have any other questions, Liv?
Hello, I'm Noor. I'm a student at RealWorks and Media Makers, and I have a question. So as a minority myself, I don't support BLM as a political organization, but I do support it as a statement. Because I see BLM as an organization that does not support like an open discussion, but rather an organization that has like a like a monolithic way of thinking. And I've seen it happen where I saw a lot of my friends and family who I see them become radicalized. And a lot of our youth in America has been radicalized to hate America, seek entitlements, and always play identity politics. And I was wondering if you can tell me, as someone who doesn't support this movement, why should I support it? And what can I tell some of my other friends who do not support BLM? What can I tell them?
That's an excellent question. And that I thank you so much for your courage in asking that question, because whether you know it or not, Many people are thinking like you, but they just don't have the courage to speak up. And the only way that we can come together and grow as a society is if we all feel safe and supported enough to speak our minds. And so I thank you for your question. It's really important. Do any of our panelists want to jump in and answer that question for Noor? Again, he says that he doesn't support Black Lives Matter as a movement, but he does support it as a statement. But he sees it as something that could potentially radicalize young people, and that may not be a good thing. So what should he do in regards to his engagement with the BLM movement?
I'll hop in first. I'm obviously white and part of, we organize under the Black Lives Matter movement. We're not officially affiliated with Black Lives Matter as an organization. That doesn't mean I'm condemning or, condoning the organization. I think it's just something very powerful to acknowledge that on one level that there's a lot of people that feel like we have to say Black Lives Matter. And the fact that we have to make that distinction, I think goes to whether you agree with the organization or not, or you agree with the movement or not. It has to at least put some questions into people's minds. And I get a lot of blowback for organizing a lot of the protests. I grew up in Sayville, literally almost 100% white town. Yeah, I see Dr. Johnson shaking his head, yes. It's difficult, right? Because not only do you have what the movement is saying, but then there's a lot of rhetoric coming back at us on things, right? So like we say Black Lives Matter and people yell at us and say Blue Lives Matter, or they yell at us and say all lives matter. And yes, all lives do matter. But the thing is that when I get pulled over by a police officer, I'm not worried about my life. I don't think I'm going to jail. I don't think I'm going to be searched unlawfully. I think they're going to look at me and say, you were speeding, ma'am, here's your ticket. Or most of the time they let me off. So like, and I'm sure if we asked other people on this panel, they would have a very, very different view of that situation. And we have to at least acknowledge that there's differences on how people are treated. So it's not so much that I would just say, keep an open mind about how you think, keep conversation going in all directions. I will tell you that I've sat down with representatives from the PBAs and people who organize Back the Blue rallies, and those have been some really interesting conversations, but that dialogue needs to happen. So that would be my, what I would hope for you, that you would at least keep that dialogue open.
Any other panelists? Yes, Dr. Johnson.
And I would also just make stress it's so important to understand the historical and sociological and psychological underpinnings of Black Lives Matter. I'm not an affiliate. I'm not a member. The slogan is a reminder to people that Black lives do matter because they're disproportionately killed, unarmed in the street. They're disproportionately searched. They're disproportionately arrested. They go to prison at a higher rate disproportionately than their white counterpart. We have to understand that this mass incarceration and all of these different forms of brutality have existed ever since policing existed, ever since before policing existed. So when you use the word radicalize, you gotta understand or the usage of that word in this moment, right? And you have to understand, well, where's the protest coming from? They're protesting essentially against police brutality. What was Dr. King protesting against? What was Malcolm X protesting against? What was the Black Panther Party for Self-Defense protesting against? What were they protesting against in the 1940s when they were saying, I am a man, right? Mm-hmm. They didn't have the response when they were wearing those big old placards that said, I am a man. The response from white men was like, I'm a man too. I'm a man. You're not saying what am I, an animal? That wasn't the thing, because they understood that would be a foolish, ridiculous argument, right? When someone's trying to assert that, yes, we matter too, and we have to say it because it appears as if you don't understand that, it's not radical. The group is, look, the group is what the group is, right? But where does it come from? And that's what we have to keep in our minds. How people are mad. Black people have been here on average longer than everyone, outside of the indigenous folks. But if you want to go further back, Black people are mostly indigenous everywhere. The oldest bones found here on the Western Hemisphere is of a Black young lady, a Black young woman in, I believe, South America or Central America. So what we have to do is understand that Black people have been here really, really integrally a part of creating the wealthiest, most powerful nation on the planet, but suffer the worst and are the poorest. New immigrants come here, right? And basically from a lot of the fighting that the Black people and the death, blood, sweat, and tears that Black people put on the line in order for them to come here and reap the benefits of Americana. And rightfully so, if you can, right? But there is not an engagement of, oh my gosh, I appreciate that sacrifice. It's always chastisement towards Black people to calm down the rhetoric. Like, how much is enough? How much are Black people supposed to take? You can't say the myth of meritocracy is blown up. If it were true, then Black people would be the wealthiest people here because they created most of the wealth here, especially during times of enslavement. So we have to fall back and listen to the words that we use. We're saying radicalize. I don't know if it's radicalized rather than awakening people. I don't like the word usage woke because it became too powerful and everybody started saying it. And I should say not powerful, but popular, and everybody started saying it. But awakened now. You're enlightened now of the real. The cognitive dissonance is not setting in and you're leaning on the conditioning you had. You're rather accepting what you see before you. There's a radical problem here. What's been radicalized is the idea that we should accept inferior status and we should accept brutality and inequity. That's a crazy idea that radicalizes others.
So I love going after Dr. Johnson because he schools us constantly in the history, but just to add to that, sometimes we're taught that we have to say that Black Lives Matter because as if no one ever said that before. But it's interesting to think about in history how much violence and law was used to teach people, first in the United States, but then around the world, that Black lives did not matter. That's not a natural idea. Racism is not a natural idea. It was created, and it took tremendous effort and organization to create the laws that made it legal to dehumanize a Black person and make them an enslaved person. That was not an easy thing to do. And it wasn't even easy, and this is hard for people to know, but it wasn't easy to teach the white people in colonial America that the Black people should be slaves. They had to create laws. They had to say, Black people and white people can't marry each other. You don't need a law to tell people not to do something that they don't want to do. They had to make it a crime punishable by death.
And we were also 3/5 a person with
right. Well, absolutely right. Thank you for that, Valerie. Right. They had to write that into the Constitution. They had to make that a law. So there have been hundreds and hundreds of years of constant effort and violent separation to teach all of us that Black lives don't matter. So the Black Lives Matter movement is a continuation of the fight that started immediately upon the enslavement of Black people in this country to fight racism. And we should be, right, it goes to the very root. And that's what it means to be radicalized, is to go to the root. Radical is the word for root. And you go right to the root of the problem, which are the laws and the segregation and the extraordinary violence that it took to create racism. And the last thing I want to say, Nora, is that the anti-Black racism that was perfected in the United States has been imitated against all non-white people around the world.
Thank you.
And here's the other thing, the anti-racist struggle that has been led for hundreds of years by Black people in the United States has also been imitated and embraced by people all over the world. Every movement for equity, every movement for justice, which is what we started with, has learned from the fight against anti-Black racism in the United States. We are living in both the cradle of racism and anti-racism. And so to be part of the movement, which is hundreds and hundreds of years old, and unfortunately will probably be hundreds more, against racism, is something we should all be proud to be in. And if that makes us radicals, that's great. We want to uproot everything that there is to uproot about racism and turn it on its head. And the more the better.
And could we depoliticize the Black Lives Matter? Right? That's not a political slogan. Right? Blue Lives Matter is political because Black life is Black life. There's no such thing as a blue life. That's a job. That's a profession. We wake up in the morning, do whatever we do to get ready for work, go out of the door, and we are Black people. That's because that has been socialized into our community, into our society. People decide to go into policing, and you're supposed to be serving and protecting. White communities are served and protected. Black communities are policed. If you're going into, and I always ask my students in African American studies, I ask them, I said, does racism stop at the schoolhouse door? And they said, no. Does racism stop at the police department or the criminal justice apparatus? They say, no. And I said, okay, so when we're starting to talk about this whole Blue Lives Matter thing, how can that be a response? Think about it. If Blue Lives mattered so much to the folks who say it, then they would have had that as a slogan or mantra way before Black Lives Matter. And Black people are some of the most respectful people to those blue lives, because the majority of folks who kill those blue lives are white people, more specifically white men. So it's like to the tune of like 68 to 70%. So it's maddening when that is used as a counterpunch. No, blue lives matter, back to blue. Well, you should tell that to your cousins who are killing the blue, because Black people aren't doing it. We have to do better in understanding that we cannot fall into this game of fighting each other over nonsense. All Black people are fighting for is humanity. Ask yourself the question, Black people have been, again, raped, tortured, murdered, stolen from, and enslaved for centuries. And then after that, have a whole century of Jim Crow. When were Black people rehumanized? I don't know when Black people were rehumanized. And because we can't pinpoint that, we can't pinpoint the time period where we actually had an international and then a national movement towards saying everything that we did during slavery was a lie. We said that they were inferior, that was a lie. We said that they were part devil, part animal, part human, that was a lie. We did all of this for the greater good of justifying our brutality so we can make money. We didn't rehumanize Black people. We have to fight this fight because we didn't do the work as a country. That's
You're absolutely right. You're absolutely right. And I just want to center Noor really quickly. Noor, again, I have to thank you for asking your question, because look at all that has come from it. Not only do we have our panelists talking about it, I could see everyone talking about this in the chat. I want you to always remember that you should always be able to speak your mind if you feel like you are in a safe environment to do so. Your voice matters. Look what you've been able to bring out tonight. What you have to say and what you think is important, even if it's not popular. So always remember that, Noor. Thank you so much for your question. We're running into our second half. So if there's a quick question that we could ask, we've got about 4 minutes before we're going into our second half, which is talking about reform, where we're going to get into this even more if we can handle it. But if Liv, if you think there's a quick question that we can have in the next 4 minutes, let's go ahead and do so.
I think anyone that's been through like any education in America can tell that there's a severe lack of information in school textbooks and curriculum that are about anybody besides white people, specifically white people, but also men, I think. But I was thinking, like, is that an achievable goal to strive to have our textbooks and curriculums changed? And if so, is there any like ideas you have on how to achieve that?
That is an awesome, awesome question. And let me tell you something, Grace. That's something that I even thought about. I'm just a couple of years older than you, but I thought about that too when I was in school, because I had parents that were very active in talking about Black history. But when I went to school, I really didn't see anything. And not just Black history, I didn't learn the history of any of the beautiful races and that we have in this country. So that is a great question. Do we have any panelists that want to talk about whether it is an achievable goal to try and reimagine and reformat and just completely get new textbooks that tell us the truth? Is that possible? These kids want the truth. Can they get it? Lisa, yes.
I'm going to hop in before the education people do.
Good job.
So I just want to say that it is possible. And I don't want everybody to think that it's such a high goal that you can't do things locally. Shout out to Dr. Johnson, who mentioned Indigenous people earlier. My daughter is Shinnecock. And Shinnecock history was not taught in Southampton schools, which is ridiculous because they're literally on Shinnecock land. So finally, we got it to where there is Shinnecock history built in K through 12. Wow. You had to have people that were dedicated to putting that curriculum together, but you'd be surprised. There's lots of people out there with lots of information that really want to do these things. And sometimes it's just having a conversation. My co-organizer for Black Lives Matter out here, he is doing he's got Zenith Youth Program, which is going to be, on Friday nights. And it's for predominantly Black and Brown kids to learn about their own history and in a way that's relevant to them. Granted, it's not built into the school. It's something that they have to do extra. We want to get it to the point where they don't have to do something extra, that it is just, again, normal. Mm-hmm. But I think some of these things are out there, and it's, again, sometimes finding them and replicating and keeping a good network open. And I strongly stress that with kids, like when you can join other teens or other youth so you can brainstorm with each other, do it. No, don't miss the opportunity, because something that somebody next to you has thought of, or you have thought of something, that collaboration only makes all of you stronger. So that would be my little pitch for you.
Oh, awesome. We're at 8 o'clock. Can we end there and maybe go into the video, or do my educators have anything that they want to add in? Jill?
So and I know I'll be brief.
It's fine.
Nothing anti-racist is going to happen without a fight. And that we just need to remember that. The good news about that is that there is no better way to learn than to try to change something. That the essence of learning is change. And so the more we engage students in fighting for the changes that will center anti-racism, the more we'll learn. So it's not about trying to figure out like what law is going to come down and tell us how to do it. I think the more that students fight for this, and the more that the adults around them join with them and with parents, we will all learn together. And that's the only way we're going to get any kind of anti-racist curricula.
Yeah. And I'll simply say that advocacy really, really helps, and make people admit to the reason as to why they're against equity. Make them put it on paper. Why are you against equity for all children? And you have the power from the board to upper administration to change that easily.
Students, I just want to reiterate what Dr. Johnson just said, because it's such a simple yet powerful question. When you're getting together and you're coming up with things that you would like to see within your individual schools, if you receive any pushback, or even if you feel ignored, maybe a question you can ask is, why are you against equity for all students? That's a really powerful question coming from you. So just keep that in mind as you're doing your own work in your own communities to strive more for social justice outside of school and inside of school. So this was fantastic. This was Amazing. Thank you to everyone. And some of our panelists are going to be with us in the second part, but I want to go ahead and showcase the video that we have on reform so that we can dive into the second part that I'm sure is going to be just as fantastic.
What happens next after Black Lives Matter stops trending? What's next when the protests start to dwindle? When economies open up and people return to their daily lives and the movement is no longer at the forefront, what is next? What's next? Reform.
Reimagining what this world looks like starts from the ground up. We're talking about education reform, we're talking about police reform, we're talking about reforming the justice system. It's wrong to have one school dedicated to white people and white children in their upbringing, where they have all the resources that they need to succeed. They have all the professors and teachers that they need to succeed, and they're set on a track for greatness. And you go just a couple blocks down, maybe across the train tracks, and there's a black school where teachers are struggling. Classrooms are overfilled. They don't have the resources, the computers, the books to be on that same track for success. That's just the infrastructure of education. Now let's get into the actual education, the curriculum, right?
We need vast educational reform. The way in which our kids are educated, we do an excellent job at muzzling people. We claim to be a democracy, but we don't teach democracy to our children. How do you live in a racist country as an educator and you don't have to take coursework on how to reduce your own bias?
And so in my daily life, I have to actively fight it. Whether it's fighting against these metal detectors in my school, or challenging my history teacher for just teaching us something from a textbook, or challenging a teacher who doesn't even think that they're being racist, but the ideas that they're teaching are racist.
It has been easy over the years to defund the education system. When we say defund police, everyone gets into their fragility. Oh, they get real, but I want you to think about who's getting into that feeling of fragility. The folks who use the police as an arm of white supremacy, the folks who use it as their own personal security force, the Karens of the world.
The police force, if we want to talk about how it started as a slave patrol where they would take suspected runaway slaves and bring them back to their initial owners, whether they be in the South or in the North. And so what the police force is a tool used by the ruling class to enforce the racist laws that they have put in place.
The police don't need a $6 billion budget for new military spyware, for a tank that's gonna roll down the boulevard. The police don't need these toys. And they especially don't need them if they're gonna continue to hurt and harm their community that they're supposed to serve.
So when we say defund, we simply mean divert funds other places. We mean reimagine what that could be.
I don't know about you, but I'm ready. I am so ready to get into this discussion of reform. That video is so powerful and definitely what we need to be discussing at this time. So I'm just going to jump into it. Our panelists for talking about reform, I'm going to start off with Carine Williams. Carine, you are the Chief Program Strategy Officer of the Innocence Project, which is just a wonderful and incredibly important organization committed to exonerating individuals who have been wrongly convicted. Now, we know that the criminal justice system here in the United States disproportionately targets Black and brown people and young people. We know this. And right now, especially, we're having all of these discussions around reforming what the justice system looks like, defunding the police. So in your work, can you speak to what that looks like and what can our young people do to further this discussion?
Sure. Well, first of all, thank you so much for having me here, Valerie, and thank you really to everybody who's on this webinar. I'm truly, truly moved and impressed that of all the things that all of you young folks can do with your Wednesday evening, you're spending your time with us. So thank you. In terms of what our organization is doing on the question of reform, I think what we're doing is trying to make the criminal justice system more just and to make the country better. And I guess I'm scoping out a little bit because I had kind of jumped on earlier because I was hoping to be able to, but the educators did such a wonderful job to also talk to the comment that Nor made, which was wonderful. And I'm so glad that she did make it. And that little part of the language of radicalizing to hate the country, right? And in fact, reform is a great, deep act of love because we're trying to make something better. It really reminds me, I apologize if I misgendered, but it really reminds me of the James Baldwin quote, which is that, who traveled all over the world, when he said, America is the country that I love more than any other. And it's precisely because I love America that I insist on the right to criticize her perpetually. So I think oftentimes, people who are invested in status quo will create this narrative that those of us who are confronting the injustices of status quo and the depths by which our country fails to live up to its ideals are somehow, hate America or unpatriotic. And I think we can't concede that narrative ever. Maybe it's because I was born on the 4th of July, but I insist that I'm among the most patriotic people that I've ever met, because I do think that this is an amazing country. And it's because I think this is an amazing country and it has professed these ideals, which, liberty and justice for all. There's a lot of places around the world which don't purport to even meet those ideals. But of course, there's a gap between what we actually do and what we say our ideals are. And so that's what I think reform is about. Reform is about narrowing that gap and eliminating that gap and making this country live up to their ideals. I can get into a little bit more specifically about what we do at the Innocence Project, which really started, the Innocence Project started 30 years ago to focus on exonerating people who were wrongfully convicted using what was then novel science DNA technology. Since then, over the decades, the Innocence Project's mandate and mission has scoped out. After exonerating more and more, the pool of our exonerees grew larger and larger. We were able to use that data to look at what specifically along the carceral continuum, where specifically there were weak points that lead to people being wrongfully convicted. So looking at that data, finding, eyewitness misidentification, misapplication of forensic science, unreliable police informant testimony. Like there are specific things along the process of prosecution that are more vulnerable to causing innocent people to be wrongfully convicted. And so after, spending some time analyzing and assessing our data, I think the mandate and mission of the Innocence Project has scoped out even further to looking at how we can, really build a nest around these specific vulnerabilities in the system and come up with both strategies to litigate, to take people to court and fight so that we change how those particular parts of our system function, and also engage in legislative activism and advocacy and reforming how the laws are applied. So, one, for example, is access to DNA testing. A lot of times people are shocked to find out that, there's a key piece of evidence from this case where there's a question about guilt and, the state doesn't want to test it, right? And won't let you test it. And so there's, just even having access to test evidence is something that, we've been moving in different states to pass laws to change sort of access to DNA testing.
And I'm seeing here, I had kind of an idea of how this would go, but honestly, these discussions are so robust. And I'm seeing that Michaela has asked a really, really great question. Michaela, do you want to unmute and ask your question and even turn on your video, or just unmute if you want?
I actually personally know someone, a family friend, who was wrongfully convicted of murder, and he was in jail for 9 years until there was more evidence that proved him innocent. And the Breonna Taylor case got reopened when there was a big network of petitions and protests. So what can we do to shine a light on the African Americans who were wrongfully convicted of crimes?
Yeah, I think that's a great question, and you pointed to Breonna Taylor as an example. I think building communities and spaces where we educate each other about what's going on and where we sort of have unrelenting full court press. I mean, that is what it takes. It takes unrelenting pressure, both, you know, from as a practitioner, as a lawyer, like there's lots of pressure that we can put on in the courtroom. But when you look at the examples of cases where the outcome, you know, where people who were wrongfully convicted were released, because, you know, there are a ton where they're not, right? But when you look at those success stories, and I hate to call it that because they shouldn't have been wrongfully convicted in the first instance, but when you look at the success stories, what you see happened is that there's a full court press beyond just what happens in a courtroom, but what is happening in our communities, right? So networking with people, talking to people, you know, people, I always laugh when people sort of get cynical about someone posting on social media about, you know, another injustice that they've learned about, and people being dismissive of that. But I think our activism, you know, should never end with social media. It never ends with just talking about what's wrong. That's not where it ends, but it certainly is where it starts. And so I think that, you know, engaging on that level is key to raising awareness and to getting people to join you in community in this fight so that we can have a full court press.
Well, that's great. And if I can somehow, I'm going to try and do this as best as I can to also bring in Dale Ho. And when we're talking about, you know, things that are happening with communities of color and people being wrongly convicted of crimes, especially right now with the presidential election, I believe it's 13 days away, we oftentimes look on a macro level and not on a micro level. And when you're talking about Breonna Taylor, we can look at David Cameron, right? And when we can look at our elected officials on a more local level and kind of start to see where we need to also place our attention. It's not just on the White House and the Capitol, but it's down the street from you where, you know, the mayor's office is, it's where your governor's mansion is, it's all of these things. So Dale, you are the director of the ACLU's Voting Rights Project, and you supervise the ACLU's voting rights litigation nationwide. You've argued voting rights cases in over a dozen of states in the country, and most notably, you have argued before the Supreme Court. And as an attorney, I just bow down to you for that. And before we go any further, I'd like to show a little clip of a documentary film called The Fight, which showcases the work that you did for voting rights in the case that you argued before the Supreme Court. Liv, can we show a little bit of that?
Mr. Chief Justice, and may it please the court, the Secretary's decision rested on a single assertion that don't do this tomorrow.
Have you argued in front of the Supreme Court before?
No.
Nearly 2,000 children have been separated from their families.
ACLU, good morning.
Hundreds of parents have just lost their kids.
Free our children now!
My job is to make sure the horror of what's going on stays front and center.
Do you believe in punishment for abortion? There has to be some form of punishment.
You can't be serious. The government can't ban people from accessing abortion.
This is the president's declaration of like open season on trans people.
Transgenderism is a mental dysfunction.
They want to erase trans people from public life.
6 states would lose a seat in Congress. It's all based on the census. Kind of difficult to imagine higher stakes.
The A stands for American. Americans come first. We don't appreciate your work.
You're a filthy organization. Obviously, most of you are pedophiles.
We are scrambling.
We've been actually working up a challenge.
Simran, you're literally pulling my computer off the desk.
You're not going to win every fight. Just thinking on my own kids, it's just inconceivable.
People say, why don't you go work at a law firm? Why have this level of stress riding on your shoulders? If we lose this case, I don't know what Roe versus Wade means.
President Trump wins.
What happened, Maya?
3 minutes.
I can't go on right away.
We will go back into court. We will them up.
All I've ever known how to do is fight, and so we just keep fighting. That's what we do.
We are here right now.
If I'm not going to be a civil rights lawyer right now, in this moment, when.
Goodness gracious, that is just so powerful. And if you are interested in watching the entire film, it is streaming on Hulu right now. And if it's streaming other places, let us know in the chat. But I know it's on Hulu because I already started watching it. So Dale, could you please speak to us, especially in our current climate, not just again on a macro level, although we are 13 days out from the presidential election, but also on our state level, on our local level about voting rights. We have heard over the past several months from Texas to Florida and every place in between of all of the different things that have happened to suppress and threaten people's right to vote. We have governors that are taking out mailboxes in Texas. We have DeJoy, our Postmaster General, who stripped out mailboxes and stripped out the sorting machines. We have people who are being intimidated in Florida as of yesterday by the Proud Boys sending emails threatening them to vote Republican or else. Can you talk to us about voting in America, and especially with our youth, because that's one present that they get when they turn 18. They may not get a car and they still may be at mom and dad's house, but they do get the right to vote. So can you talk to us about that?
I'm happy to, and I just want to say I'm really happy to be here tonight. It's a real honor to be here and get a chance to talk to all of you. It's particularly great for me to see Carine, with whom I went to law school. It's really great to see you, Carine. It's a kind of a crazy time in so many ways, and the way that we deal with elections and voting rights is no exception to that. I'm not just talking about the pandemic. I'm talking about just the last 10 years in this country, where we have seen unrelenting attacks on the right to vote, unlike anything we've seen in years and decades. I mean, if you think back to like 2000 and the Bush versus Gore election, I mean, that was terrible. That was awful in so many ways. So many people lost their right to vote because of incompetence, bad ballots, bad machines that were from the 1950s and the 1960s, and then also intentional efforts to prevent Black people from voting in Florida with erroneous lists that purported to show who was ineligible to vote because of a felony conviction that were matched against the voter files, and people kicked off at the last minute before the election took place and not knowing that their registrations had been interfered with. And, the consequences of that can't be overstated. When the presidential election came down to just 500 votes in one state. But even then, I would say we were in a better place in terms of the right to vote as a country, in terms of the climate and the conversations that we were having. Even then, when there were efforts to suppress the right to vote, you couldn't sort of take that as a position in respectable conversation as a political leader and be taken seriously. You had to be in favor of the right to vote because there was this broad consensus we had in this country that, maybe we have disagreements about particulars, but that generally we should be making voting easier. We should be bringing more people into the process. This consensus that we had starting in 1965 when the Selma and Montgomery March happened and the Voting Rights Act was passed, that still existed in the 2000s. Florida was terrible in 2000, but out of that, Congress passed a law called the Help America Vote Act, which brought our voting machines very briefly into the 21st century. It passed with bipartisan support. George Bush signed that into law. A few years later, in 2006, the Voting Rights Act was, that had originally passed in 1965. It was passed again in Congress. It was expanded. The United States Senate was unanimous in favor of it. George Bush signed it into law. You couldn't be a major leader in a political party and not publicly support voting rights, even if maybe you didn't agree with everything that people like me wanted to fight for. That has changed. And now you have people out there explicitly saying, we need fewer people voting. Mm-hmm. You have a senator from Utah saying, we don't live in a democracy, right? And you have efforts in state after state that we have filed lawsuits against at the ACLU and at the place I used to work before I came there, the NAACP Legal Defense Fund, against these laws that, 10 years ago weren't happening, right? Laws that make it harder for people to register to vote or to cast a ballot. And the basic agreement that we had in this country that we live in a democracy, that everyone matters, that people from all communities should be represented and treated equally. We have one side in this country that is actively fighting against those very basic bedrock principles that should be non-controversial. So that's where we are in terms of voting rights. But I think the bright side is there has been, I think, incredible mobilization and energy and engagement in response to this, right? Over 40 million people have already voted in this election. I mean, so we talk about the election being like 2 weeks away. It's not 2 weeks away. It is now. And if you compare that to 2016, 4 years ago, we had about 15 million people who had voted at this point. So already 2.5 times as many people have voted as had at this point 4 years ago, even in a place like Texas, right? Really, really terrible voter suppression in Texas. The governor, as you said, is getting rid of boxes where people can drop off their ballots. Already we have had, if you look at the votes that have been cast this year, 60% as many votes cast this year already as cast in all of 2016, right? And we still have almost 2 weeks to go. So I'm really, really, as terrified as I am when I look around and see where the country is, I'm also really, really encouraged by the engagement from people and from young people in particular right now.
I would agree with you. And what you just said, all of what you said, of course, was very poignant and important. But the last part, particularly for our young people that are listening, don't ever think that your vote doesn't matter. Don't ever think that your vote doesn't count. Some of you may not have been here yet on the planet with the Bush v. Gore, but for those of us who were, we really do understand that every vote matters. And even more recently, in the last presidential election, it's not along party lines. If we could just look at the numbers and see, how those numbers fared out. So you may hear some of your friends say, oh, it doesn't matter. No one votes. Our votes don't matter. Really, really guard your heart against that. Every vote matters. Every vote counts because your vote is your voice and you matter and your votes count. So I want to kick it off. Actually, thank you so much, Dale. And again, everyone, The Fight is streaming on Hulu. And so definitely check it out if you haven't already. But I want to bring in, is it Gilana or Gilliana? I want to make sure that I pronounce your name correctly.
Gilana.
Gilana. Oh, that's even more beautiful. So Gilana and also KJ, both of you are in this fight. You're seeing and hearing what's going on with your friends. KJ, you're a young activist and you've been filming activism on the ground. Gil Scott Heron said that the revolution would not be televised, but you're actually filming it, which is amazing. And Gilliana, I've read some of your pieces that appeared on Medium when you're talking about how your bus ride to school is more integrated than your school itself. So when we're talking about reform, when we're talking about Carine's work with the Innocence Project and making sure that we can put things in place so that our people are not, becoming mass incarcerated, or what Dale is talking about when we're talking about the right to vote and making sure that our voices are heard. What are you all experiencing on the ground when you're writing your pieces and you're filming the activism? What can you speak to us about reform?
Gilana, you first.
Okay, so same as Maryam, I'm a part of Teens Take Charge, which is a student-led organization fighting for integration and equity in the New York City school system, which is one of the most segregated in the country, even though New York City is such a diverse place. And Black and Brown students are put at a disadvantage from the moment they enter into the school system. So Teens Take Charge is working really hard to integrate and elevate student voices. And we have events where students share their testimonies and experiences and have a safe space to talk about those issues. And we also have campaigns where we demand policy change. So, I mean, some of our past campaigns have been Save SYEP, where we worked to stop de Blasio from cutting the 75,000 summer jobs provided to youth. We weren't able to save all 75,000, but SYEP did happen this summer, and that was a lot of hard work. We have Education Unscreened, which is working to eliminate discriminatory screens from the high school admissions process, which are a huge contributor to the segregation. And we are actually deciding what campaigns to focus on this year in an issues assembly, which is on Monday, October 26th, where we're inviting student activists and organizers to come and share what issues they are passionate about and what issues they think Teens Take Charge should focus on fighting for this year. So if there's students on this call, you should all come to that.
That is amazing. That is, to know that this work is being done by such young people is really inspiring to me, and it's so great to hear. And I just want to say on a personal note, just to encourage you to keep going. I have this little saying that I put at the end of my emails: keep pushing, because it can get hard, it can get overwhelming, but you all are doing fantastic work and it's necessary work. So I just want you to know that you're appreciated and to keep going and lean on your resources. Not to kind of throw you out there, Lisa, but you seem like a great person that would, be able to maybe partner with Teens Take Charge and maybe attend one of their meetings to help them. I'm just throwing that out there. Sorry, it just seemed like Lisa would be such a great person for you guys. But KJ, what about you? Again, filming the activism, filming the people, that the young people that are marching and taking charge and things of that nature. What are you seeing in regards to reform, not just in filming it, but what are you feeling like needs to happen to go forward?
Yeah, before I even start, just want to thank you, RealWorks, as well as everyone here for joining me on this panel and in this town hall. And I want to talk about reform in a way that isn't really discussed, and that's reform within yourself, right? So prefacing or going back to Nora's question about Black Lives Matter and how it's a political statement and why they're so upset and why they're so mad. And I want to use a James Baldwin quote like Miss Williams. He said, to be Black and to be conscious in America is to be in a constant state of rage, right? And so instead of asking why they're so upset, ask yourself, why am I not upset? Ask yourself, how did they get to be this upset, right? And so I think the greatest reform that we could do is reform within ourselves, constantly educating ourselves, constantly learning, constantly growing, right? There's no growth without change. So when we're talking about reform, in order for you to be a part of this movement, you're going to have to go through some tough times. You're going to have to go through some, cognitive dissonance where this doesn't line up with how you're thinking, all right? You got to reform the way you think and then join the fight. And so, I mean, I've gone through the process. Everyone here has gone through the process. We're all going to be going through that process at a different level because we're all on our different journey. But from the moment I picked up a camera and then now going to these movements, these marches, and I'm out there and I'm seeing the movement be so colored, not just Black people. It's not just men and women anymore, right? It's Latinos, it's Asians, it's everyone. And I think that's the beauty of the movement today, how it's an all-inclusive movement and how we're all fighting for reforms to take place. That's what I see now on the front lines.
I think that's beautiful. And one thing that you brought up is that you're going to have to go through some tough times, maybe even some tough conversations. And so since we have our teens, our youth paying attention to what we're talking about tonight, does anyone want to weigh in on ways that we can have these tough conversations. I presume that there are a lot of teens that may be having tough conversations within their families and their households, or want to have these tough conversations, but really don't know how to do it. If we're going to talk about reforming within oneself, like KJ mentioned, that reforming within oneself, reforming within one's own home environment. Is there any suggestions for our teens from any of our panelists on how they may be able to safely and in a healthy way go about their own inner reform and reforms within their own household? Because once we can get our household healthy, we can start to go out and do these things in the world. But our teens need some advice, need some tools on how to do that. Does anybody have anything to add?
So I'll jump in. So just very briefly, we tell kids in school all the time, you learn by doing, right? When we want them to learn to read, we give them a book. When we want them to learn to do mathematics, we put a math problem in front of them. And we don't say, wait till you feel ready to do it. You learn math by doing math. You learn to read by reading. And you learn to change the world by changing the world. And so this idea that I'm going to wait until I'm ready, the only way to get ready is to do it. And so I think that these conversations that are difficult with people are much easier when you're engaged in making the change together. And so it's that forward motion of movements, and every reform that's ever led to more equity has been the consequence of masses and masses and masses of people in motion together. And so I think any reform, getting rid of the screens, getting rid of in the high school admissions process, getting rid of the metal detectors in the schools, fighting to change the curriculum, that as students are doing those things together and engaging the other people in their households with them in those struggles, that will make the conversation about what you're doing together. That's how we learn.
Yeah.
So.
Dr. Johnson, anything?
I would say, think about how uncomfortable it is to walk out of your door and be instantly racialized and then criminalized, right? And it's institutional in the way in which it manifests. So it's like, to not have the uncomfortable conversation while someone is living in an uncomfortable existence is kind of, we have to really kind of prioritize what do we want. What do they say? Injustice anywhere is an injustice everywhere. We have to care more about what equity means for all of us than about our own comfort level. Comfort is, unfortunately, in 2020, is not a luxury that any of us have, right? This is one of the most uncomfortable. 2020 is a dumpster fire trash bin, right? Throw it away, the whole year away. So we've all experienced a form of loss or multiple forms of loss, whether it be actual family or whether it be, friends or whatever have you. Our sense of normalcy has been disrupted. But I always tell people, who feel like they're completely out of sorts, I'm like, imagine how Black people feel. Imagine how other people of color feel every single day, where they feel unheard. They feel trivialized, marginalized, out of sorts, not respected. So we have to really get away from the idea of I'm uncomfortable. Okay, so ask yourself, why are you uncomfortable? And once we start asking ourselves questions, right? When we engage with people, try your best not to tell people what they should do, right? Like, a lot of times when we want to teach, sometimes we're talking at people, and that's not as receptive as if you engage in dialogue and ask questions. And sometimes quiet your voice, quiet what you want to say when you just ask questions. Well, how do you think these people feel? Well, how do you feel about how they feel? Is this right? Is this equitable? Is this good? Is this just? And if those questions are coming out, well, no, this is not right. This is not equitable. This is not just. Then we have to figure out, then how are we going to go about making this an equitable space for all? And so that will be, my suggestion. Be very versed on the topic that you're talking about, so you know most of the answers to the questions that you're asking, but engage in those questions and lead them to the spaces you want to lead them. Because again, just like engaging a school board or upper administration, make people admit as to why they're not trying to be on the side of righteousness. Why is it difficult for you to be on the side of goodness doing what's right?
Very good, very good. And Liv, do we have any questions that we can pose to all of our panelists? Speaking about not only the reform, but also the first panel talking about justice. Let's open it up.
Hi. Okay. So earlier, I had a question about how, because I know that in my school, I go to the same school as Michaela. She spoke earlier, and I'm a senior, and we have like a senior leadership group that speaks with the principal and like other school faculty members. And we are having more conversations about systemic racism and how we address that in our school. But I feel like it's just not being addressed enough. Like there's not much change actually happening, even though these conversations are starting in more depth now. The change is really slow, and that's what's really frustrating. So my question was, how can we turn this dream of like having this improved education curriculum that focuses on civic engagement classes, because those are so necessary. And before, when we were talking about implicit biases, I did a research paper on that in one of my AP classes. And before I did that paper, I really never heard that word spoken in any of my social studies classes before. And that's a real big issue, because it's such an important root of all the problems that are happening right now. So my question is, how can we make this into reality? How can we improve our education system and implement a greater focus on civic engagement courses? And how can the youth advocate for that in their communities?
Jill, can you speak to this? Because you really worked to create an anti-racist school and came up against all types of pushback and challenges in trying to create that. So can you weigh in on this?
Sure. Well, the one thing I'll say, Ashley, is keep on doing it. And, we have the assistant principal at our school, a woman by the name of Carla Laban, a great educator, used to say to us all the time, if you're not in this fight for your whole life, you're not in the fight. And so I don't say that in a discouraging way. I just say that there are generations of people before us who laid the foundation for us to be able to pick up this banner and to keep fighting against racism. And so victory isn't an individual event, it's a humanity event. So everything that you guys do is important and it matters. And it's part of a much larger movement. The other thing I'll say, just practically from a school, is pick something you want to change. So I'm just going to go out on a limb here. And you mentioned your AP class. So I imagine that there are some students in your school in AP classes and some students who aren't. Maybe, and I could be wrong about that, I don't know the school, but one thing that we did at our school is we got rid of all tracking. And by that, I mean, there were no classes that were open to some students and not open to others, not even by choice. So if the advanced placement US history curriculum is considered the best, and whether it is or it isn't, we can have that conversation. But we always said there shouldn't be best classes or advanced classes, because anytime you say there's a good school, a best school, a good class, an advanced class, by definition, we're saying there's a bad school or a worst school or a not so advanced class or a not smart class, no matter what anybody says it. And before you decide who should be in the best classes, you have to put yourself on the line and say, because these people should be in the bad classes. And we shouldn't be willing to do that. So sometimes one thing that pushes the needle forward a little bit, and we did this all the time, take something that you know isn't right. And even if you don't know exactly how to make it better, you can say, we have to figure this out, right? In other words, we keep doing things all the time when we know the results are really bad. So why are we more comfortable doing something we know how to do, even though the consequences are horrible, we're more willing to do that than to do something with all of the best intentions and to make some mistakes. We're going to make some mistakes. So maybe if you can move some of the conversations into, let's pick a campaign. Let's pick something we want to change, whatever it is at your school, if it has to do with policing or which courses are open to which students, or how students are assigned to schools, or how students are assigned to classes, or are students suspended? Why are they suspended? What is it that makes a person not part of our community anymore? How do we deal with the mistakes that we made? So there are lots and lots of things, but what I would say just in a nutshell is do it right away. Jump in.
And I'd also like to say also, Ashley, don't give up. Sometimes we, especially in our society where we can get things so quickly, that if we don't receive results quickly, we think that nothing is happening and we give up. It may not be before you graduate that you want to see the changes that you're pushing for, but you've started, and there will be students behind you that will pick up the baton and they'll keep going, especially if you encourage them to do so. So don't grow impatient and don't grow weary. Change doesn't happen overnight, but the fact that you're asking the questions and you want to start, and I hope that you get started, keep going and don't worry about it not happening overnight or next week or by the end of your school year. Just keep going and it will happen. Are there any other questions, Liv, that we can pose?
I just wanted to jump in really quickly.
Oh yeah, sure, sorry.
A small thing about Ashley's comment, which thank you, Ashley, for speaking up and sharing it with us. And that is, as Jill said, this is a life fight if you're in it. And you have to celebrate your wins. It sounds like you guys have already done something pretty tremendous by getting these conversations going. And you acknowledged in your own comment that this is new for your school. So, you never want to, obviously you don't want to rest on any laurels here, but don't shortchange yourself and what you've clearly already accomplished by getting these conversations going in your school. And don't underestimate the power of having those conversations be all around you.
Mm-hmm.
And can I just piggyback and say, look for tangibles in these conversations. A lot of times people skillfully kind of don't have a discussion about what tangible results, how we're going to measure this discussion, the thing that we say that we are implementing. So if you're going to have these discussions with people who are open to these discussions, and you're talking about a particular change that you want to implement, have goals in mind. Now, you don't have to hit those goals exactly, but have some tangibles that you want to come away from it, so it can't just be continued to be pushed and pushed and pushed along. When you come back to meet, what do we get accomplished towards this goal?
Mm-hmm.
So I guess my question is, I just want to thank everybody for being here, and it's been really amazing. I'm a public school educator and a parent of 2 students who have gone through the New York City public schools. My son actually graduated from the school that Jill Bloomberg was the former principal at. And I guess my question is, when we think about transforming our school system, and we think about the little pockets in our schools that are trying to do this work, how do we actually move towards transforming the system within itself? Because I'm an educator myself. I work in a middle school. The power of the collective is really important, but it's exhausting, and I will never stop fighting personally, and I don't think my children will, because of the decisions I made for them in their school choices. But I just wonder, at what point do we really demand from the systems in which we exist in that they are not allowed to continue to perpetuate the inequities of our school system. Like I appreciate all of the student leadership, but I'm at a point where I want real transformation. That's not just about like, wow, your school or the school your child went to is so beautiful and wonderful and exceptional. These are not the schools that should be exceptions. These are the schools that are about transforming our society, and we can't wait any longer. So how do we do that? And I know the election's coming, but that's like a global decision. We have a mayor who has been, you know, pittering around this topic for 7 years, has done nothing to change the actual system of enrollment in our New York City public schools. And I know that you're not all in New York City, but it's just, it's frustrating. I'm angry. And anger is good. I think my anger and my channeling of anger is good, but I want to know what we can do to actually make real change, because this is how we change societies, with the young people. So our schools should not be majority status quo racist institutions anymore. That's my question, or my call to action.
I'll go first. I think different systems work differently. So in the city school system, I mean, depending upon, you know, the next mayoral election, you know, certain points, certain questions for that person who wants that position of power have to be asked and then demanded. Like, again, tangibles. You know, what do you intend to do? Here's what the latest studies have shown. Every time I speak to an educator or an upper administration about change that needs to happen, I present the facts first. I present the research and the data. And basically, I've been told, I mean, I've presented to upper administrators before about, you know, the Hofstra study about the lack of diversity in schools and everything that came along with that. Then the New York State study that came out later on, I believe in the same year. And then my 5th chapter of my dissertation, as well as other research. And in certain instances, it was just kind of like, in other words, we hold the power, especially on Long Island, the little fiefdom. They can do whatever it is they're comfortable or enough to do. So if they're comfortable maintaining racist institutions, they will. If there is no pressure from the community, because I think on Long Island, if you have enough pressure, enough parents that say, whoa, we're not doing that. This is what we want, and we want tangibles, and we want a plan. What are you going to do? That can move the needle tremendously, because a lot of people that serve on these boards, they're about power or their next political stair step. You know, they're trying to make some sort of either power in the community, or they're trying to make some other political move later on. So in these suburb type situations, community is super important. In the city situation, it's a little, I think it would probably, in my opinion, it would take also that groundswell to where if someone wants that job, that those are questions. What is your platform suggesting? How is your platform going to change this thing that we've been talking about for so long when we haven't seen any movement? We're not going to give you our support unless we have a tangible platform that we can then kind of grade. And we can see, like, if you get into the seat of power, then we want to see how you're going to implement that. Step 1, step 2, when does that happen? It has to be almost like a constant reminder for that person who's in the seat of power. What are you doing? What have you done? And what are you intending to do?
And are you talking about, with seats of power, are you talking about local school boards where we're having these elections and putting people in place? We're voting these people into place. Are we talking about being able to shift the power by shifting what we're voting?
I think
we're voting in.
There definitely needs to be some sort of reform when we're talking about how even the school board operates. Because sometimes school boards and upper administrations get in bed together where they're not supposed to. I asked an upper administrator once, I said, you're hired because you're an educational leader, correct? She said, yes. I said, you're hired based upon your expertise in leadership, correct? She said, yes. Your leadership is based upon research and data and facts, correct? She said, yes. Your job is then to make informed recommendations based upon research and data to the school board, correct? Yes. So if this is a concern of yours, how come it's not being addressed with the school board? And it was a long pause. I said, because the only deductive reasoning that I can come up with is that it's biased or systemically racist. And it was a very long pause, which to me was my answer, which means the community in these suburbs who have these seats of power, they don't get paid, but they have a lot of power, and these budgets of $150 million in these districts. We need to have people in the community coming to the table and demanding. But even the way in which they count votes for the school board election is scary to me. You have people's family members who are on the board counting votes. That's insane to me. You have administrators who love the way in which the school board is operating, counting votes because they're in together.
So when we're talking about reform, this is really great. And thank you, Melissa, again, because this is really good for what we're speaking about right now. We've got 5 minutes left, but we're going to do this. How then can we reform these pockets of power, because they exist in all of our communities? How can we get people within our communities to start having these discussions in their home, to start demanding more? Because what we do know is that these pockets of power pick the people that they want to be there. And we go and we just, we vote, we do whatever, we don't pay as much attention. How can we start to bring this to the fore in our communities so that we can start challenging these pockets of power? So
I'm going to, say to Melissa what I said to Ashley, and I want to remind us that a very, very relatively small group of people in Ferguson, Missouri, after Michael Brown was killed by the police, changed the national dialogue many years ago. And they, that was a small group of young people who said enough and who protested vigorously against the injustice. And we all owe them a huge debt. And I think that what we need to do is not that hard to figure out. We're not lacking the way, we're lacking the will. And that comes from collective action. It has to be. I will say personally, whatever position of power I had as a principal at a school is not where my power came from. It came from the students, and it came from their parents, and it came from the massive support of a very small community whose collective voices made some changes in getting rid of screens. And that's a success and a victory. And there isn't another way. There just isn't. And so we just have to embrace that there will be change when masses of people demand it. And
can I piggyback just 2 seconds? That's phenomenal. Black people and other people of color are exhausted. And I think that's what really, in these moments, how long? I mean, like I give it up to Mr. Ho and Ms. Williams about their dedication to just doing the righteous thing. I mean, the heart that you have to have and the dedication that you have to do those things. But I think people in the community are like, how long do we have to fight for what we deserve and that our ancestors already died for? And it's frustrating. But at the end of the day, that's what it's going to take. This journey is a marathon. I said it before in a protest. I said, it took hundreds of years to get this situation the way it is. It's going to take our lifetimes and some to rectify it. So that's really where we're at right now.
I'm moving over in my screen so you all can see Marshall behind me, of the NAACP LDF. I mean, this is a generational fight, and we have to be unrelenting about it. It's not just, I guess to the point where Jill and I were talking earlier about our lifetime, it's about lifetimes, plural, for sure.
Absolutely. Dale, do you have anything you'd like to add?
Well, I just wanted to say, and I don't know if this is the note to end on, I certainly don't want to make it the one to end on, but when I talked about how excited I am about all the civic engagement around this election, it's great, but there is a difference and I think a deficiency that we have, and I don't want to, put more on people who on those of us who are already trying to do so much and are and are so tired, as Dr. Johnson put it. But the energy that we're seeing for this national election that we're seeing in November, that's great. But we don't see the same kind of energy about the local elections that directly impact people's day-to-day lives. Education policy, criminal justice policy, policing, these are decisions that local governments have so much more control over than, you know, what's happening down in DC at the national level. And we need to see the same kind of engagement in our own communities on those issues in those local elections. If we had a fraction of what we're seeing for the November election in our local elections, we could do a lot. And I don't want to, obviously, you know, there are a lot of things at play right now, but Jill mentioned Ferguson. You know, after Michael Brown was shot, I took a look at what the electorate was like in Ferguson, what the schools were like in Ferguson. And one thing I noticed was you have a school district there that was 80% Black students, the Ferguson Florissant School Board, and a school board that had 1 Black member, right, out of 7, 6 white, 1 Black member, right? And I was like, how can this be? And part of it was institutional racism, you know, when the elections were held, the structure of the way that the elections were structured, which depressed turnout. But at the end of the day, one of the big problems was turnout in local elections in Ferguson was under 10%.
Yeah.
Right. Now, I don't want to blame, you know, the voters there. There are a lot of reasons why people in that community felt and feel disempowered. Right. But I do think it speaks to how much potential there is, right? How much room there is for energy and activism, and we saw it in the protests after Michael Brown was shot. There is just so much power in the people, and you know, folks wouldn't be trying to take away our right to vote if it weren't so powerful.
Absolutely, absolutely, and I hate to end this discussion. This is the best thing I've done all week. Probably will be the best thing I do all week. This is fantastic. I want to thank everyone who participated here tonight: Jill Bloomberg, Dr. Aaron Johnson, Carine Williams, Dale Ho, KJ, Lisa, who's gone off the call now, and all of you youth and students who have participated. This has been fantastic. We're having a lot of important conversations in our country right now, and I am so glad that we were able to come together to have these conversations. Real Works will be putting up the QR code for the toolkit that they want to provide everyone, and they will also be making this recording available, and we will have more town halls in the future. But if I could just leave you with one sentiment, and it's been something that we've discussed throughout the night, it's the through line, is just to keep fighting and keep pushing. You can grow tired, do not grow weary, do not give up. It is all important. Your voice is important. Change is happening, and we need you to stay in the fight. Lean on your resources. And just stay strong. So thank you everyone for participating tonight. And I hope to see you all in the next town hall with Real Works. Thank you so much, and have a great Wednesday night.